Well, in the summer of 1941, I was 19. And my best friend and I, and fraternity brother, we'd graduated from high school together and gone to college in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where we lived. And we had determined, at 19, you're smarter than any time in your life. We determined that that America was going to become involved, but we didn't know when. And we thought, since we both wanted to learn to fly, that we would go to Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force and be trained and get our wings, and then if and when America became involved, we'd be a step ahead of everybody else, and we could transfer into our Army Air Corps, which was what it was known as then. And so we both applied, and they said, sure, we'd love to train you. Come on up. And so they sent us the applications. And because we were underage, it required parental consent. So my best friend, Sully, was an only child. His father had been terribly mustard gassed in the First World War, and died before Sully knew him. But his mother said, when he confronted her about going to Canada, well, Sully, if you really feel this is what you ought to do, you have my blessing. So I went home thinking, well, I'd probably get a similar reaction from my parents. And my mother pretty well echoed Mrs. Sullivan's by saying, well, she hated to see me go into service, but if I felt that that would be to my advantage, why, she would approve. My father, however, went through the overhead and he said, you blithering idiots, that's not our war, and you're not involved in any way, and you get back in school. So as a result, my friend went ahead, and he was trained on Spitfires and went through the North African campaign, chasing Rommel, and survived. And Pearl Harbor occurred that December. And of course, once that happened, we were involved, and there was no question about whether or not I could serve. Mm-hmm. And so I joined up along with a number of my fraternity brothers right after Pearl Harbor occurred, and got accepted as an aviation cadet to get my flight training with the Army Air Corps. Well, actually, when I reported to pre-flight, I was one of 4,000 aviation cadets. And they got us all out on the parade grounds, and they had a contest as to who could stand in the middle of the parade ground and shout at the top of his lungs, "Pass in review!" I won. So I was designated as the cadet wing adjutant for that duty. This helped me because when I went to pre-flight, because I had been a cadet officer in pre-flight when I went to primary training, they made me the captain of my class. And so I went through primary, basic, and advanced training as the captain of my flight class. And that helped me because I was about to be washed out in basic because I was not able to master the BT-13, the Vultee vibrator, and I was about to be, if you were given 12 hours of dual training instruction, and if you weren't able to solo after that 12 hours, you were washed out as a pilot. and then you became a bombardier or a navigator or a buck private. So I got almost to up to 12 hours, and I had an instructor who at that time was a West Pointer, and he didn't know how to fly that airplane himself. So I really wasn't getting adequate instruction. But they said, well, if we wash out the captain, the cadet captain, that's going to have a pretty negative effect on the rest of the class. So this civilian instructor who had thousands of hours in this particular type of aircraft stepped forward and he said, well, you let me take Luckadoo for 30 minutes, and if he can't solo, wash him out. So he took me out to an auxiliary field out from the main base in Shawfield, South Carolina. And we landed, and he got out on the wing and he said, Luckadoo, if you can take this airplane up and land it 3 times without killing yourself, I'll pass you. But I'm going to go over and sit under that tree and smoke a cigarette, and I'm not going to fly with you. So he cut me loose. But he had given me 30 minutes of his instruction, which was more than I had gotten to date, and shown me exactly how to fly the airplane, and I did. I managed to get it up and get it down. And he didn't say a word. He got back in the cockpit and said, take me back to the base. Let's go back to the base. So we flew back. He crawls out and he says, you're good to go. Or else I would never have gotten my wings. Upon graduation from Twin Engine Flying School in Georgia, Moody Field in Valdosta, Georgia, they assigned 40 of my classmates and me to go immediately upon graduation to Kearney, Nebraska. And well, first we were assigned to a redistribution center in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we went there, and from there we were sent to the 100 Bombs group that was then stationed in Kearney, Nebraska, who was about to go overseas. And we'd never been in a B-17 in our lives. So they inserted us as co-pilots, and they took the co-pilots that we replaced and made them first pilots and gave them crews and sent them to different groups. But that's a mystery as to why they did that with that particular group and our particular class. But ultimately, of the 40 that went to the 100th, because of the record of the 100th, only 4 of us managed to complete a tour and survive. Obviously, the only instructions that we had before we left for overseas, flying our own airplanes across the North Atlantic to the combat zone, was from the pilot that we were assigned to. We had not had the benefit of going through the training of pre-combat that all of the rest of the crew had gone through for 3 months. So we didn't have instrument training, we didn't have navigational training, we didn't have flying training, really, with that particular type of equipment, that aircraft. Fell in love with the B-17 because it was a dream to fly. And I did catch on to that rather quickly. But the pilot that I was assigned to was not terribly, he wanted to fly himself. And so he did not let me share a whole lot in making frequent landings and takeoffs, and also training me in emergency procedures. That was the important thing, because surely you were going to encounter emergencies in combat, and you were going to have to learn how to cope with them, with those, and do so almost by reflective action, because you weren't going to have a whole lot of time to think about it or fiddle with it or experiment and find what would work and what wouldn't. The main thing that was lacking was instrument instruction, because we were flying in very, very adverse climate and clouds, fog, rain, and immense cold, terrible cold. And so our record as far as losses was concerned was directly attributable to the fact that we were not sufficiently trained when we had to go into combat. And as the co-pilot, you're the second in command of the entire crew. And certainly as a young whippersnapper, shaved tail, second lieutenant, fresh out of flying school, the burden and the responsibility of not only the airplane, but the rest of the crew was overpowering. We were shipped overseas, and we flew from Kearney, Nebraska to Bangor, Maine, from Bangor, Maine to Gander Lake, Newfoundland. And then because we had installed these extra fuel tanks and had extra fuel also in a big inflatable tank in the bomb bay, we extended our range so that we could fly from Gander Lake directly to Ayr, Scotland, which was right outside of Prestwick, which was, we had to wait on a full tailwind in order to make that long a jump. But oddly enough, as we were waiting, the pilot I was assigned to got bored, and one night he went across the base and shacked up with this WAF, British Auxiliary Force gal, and contracted a raging case of venereal disease and was thrown into the hospital. So the rest of the group proceeded to go singly on across the North Atlantic and left us sitting there for over 2 weeks while he recovered. And at that time, the only thing that they had to treat VD with was sulfa. So when he was finally released, he was so weak and been flat of his back for 2 weeks, he couldn't get in the airplane. We had to load him into the airplane. So he said, "Lucky, you're going to have to fly across the Atlantic." And unfortunately, when I was assigned to this crew originally, both the navigator and the bombardier loved their co-pilot, my successor. And they highly resented me. Not only because I was so inexperienced, but I was replacing their buddy. And they'd gone through training together, and everybody had, worked as a team. And so they made my life just miserable, every way they could. And they were pretty ingenious at it. So when we arrived in Newfoundland and had this situation, I confronted them and I said, "Now you guys have made my life perfect hell." But I told the navigator, I said, "Now if you don't make landfall on the nose, I'm going to throw your butt out of the airplane without a parachute." Because if we missed England or missed the British Isles, we were lost. And the Germans did everything in their power to try and misdirect us and have us go off on a tangent. We did take off, finally, and we made landfall on the nose, and then proceeded immediately to our base and started flying combat right after that. Well, it was pretty overwhelming because we had no conception of what we were confronted with, either in terms of weather or enemy or defenses. Any of that was an unknown. And so the baptism of fire was on our first mission. We suddenly encountered all of this, these very experienced Luftwaffe pilots who really pressed their attack, and they were very determined. They didn't have a tour of duty. They flew until they were killed. And their backs were to the wall. They were defending their homeland. And all of Europe was occupied, so the minute we crossed the English Channel, we were over enemy territory. And we were playing in their backyard. And they were professionals. They'd been flying and fighting for over 4 years when we got there. And here we were just citizen soldiers, and we were being thrown up against them, or they were being thrown against us. We didn't have any fighter escort. They had no range to carry us beyond the enemy coast. And so we were going out in broad daylight, mass formation, unprotected. That had never been done before. And the British were adamant that it was suicidal. And they were right. It was. But that's what we were ordered to do and how we were ordered to do it. And we didn't have any choice. We were being confronted with, mentally and morally, war is difficult to accept because you're brought up to live by the Ten Commandments, and one is, thou shalt not kill. And we either killed or be killed. And so you didn't have any choice. And reconciling that and all of the other difficulties that you were confronted with was, pretty sobering task. So you grew up in a heck of a hurry. We went as sort of carefree college kids, thinking it was going to be a lark. It was anything but. It was serious business and a deadly business. And you realize very, very early on that you're up against some real stiff competition. And your only chances of survival were divine intervention. If you had a guardian angel riding on your shoulder, your chances were possible to survive. Well, the weather in England, or over England, and the continent is probably the worst in the world. And I remember growing up in Chattanooga. It's in the valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the fog would roll in and the rain and overcast skies, and I thought, gee, that's so depressing. If I ever get out of here, I'm never coming back. And little did I know that I'd end up in England contending with far worse weather, plus the immense cold. The irony of it was that contending with temperatures at minus 50 or 60 degrees below zero was something that greatly impaired your proficiency, your ability to function. And and of course, flying formation was very precise. We had to concentrate and focus on your job of keeping your relationship to the other airplanes in the formation, or else you became a cropper, mid-air collisions. So you're bouncing a lot of balls in the air. We had to wear all of this very unwieldy equipment, and it just wasn't easy to control the aircraft or to do our jobs with those restrictions. But we had to learn to do it, and we had to learn quickly. Our North Atlantic crossing was quite different because of the heavy loading of fuel that we were carrying and praying for a tailwind. We were so heavy when we actually took off that as we reached the end of the runway, there was a 100-foot cliff down to the water. And we barely cleared the water. We were flying 2.5 or 3 feet above the waves. And we had to continue that way for an hour, 2 hours, until we burned off enough fuel and lightened our load that we could barely start stepping up to a decent altitude function where our engines would function at a better, more efficient rate of consumption. So on the flight over, we were flying at lower altitudes. We didn't get above 10,000 feet on the way over. However, when you do get above 10,000 feet, you have to be on oxygen, and then the temperature begins to drop precipitously until you get up to 25 to 29,000, which was our usual flying or bombing altitudes, and still flying formation, and still trying to stay warm enough because you had heated underwear underneath your heavy flying equipment or suit, but it was so cumbersome. It really was difficult to function. The pilot and the co-pilot behind their seats was a half-inch plate of armor plate, steel. The space between those two was only about 12 inches. When we had all of our equipment on, we couldn't get through there. We had to get into the cockpit and then put on much of our equipment, our flak vest and our parachutes, harnesses, and that sort of thing. But let me tell you, when you're on fire, you can go through a knothole without touching either side. That was the reality of what we were dealing with. We were doing what we call dead reckoning, and we navigated by making identification of landmarks on the ground, railroad tracks or towns or shoreline, such things as that. In formation, the only navigation required, as long as you're in formation, was by the lead navigator. And he was directing the pilots and the command pilots as to what the course of the mission, how to follow the course of the mission, and making the turns, precise timing, and that sort of thing. We eventually, toward the end of my tour, borrowed from the British some radar, some very, very early and primitive radar. Initially, our rules of engagement did not permit us to drop bombs unless we could visually identify the target. So if clouds obscured the target, or if the anti-aircraft defenses were so that you couldn't make sure which target you wanted to bomb, then you didn't drop. And as a result, we'd have to bring the bomb load back and drop it in the channel so we wouldn't be landing with it, because that was too dangerous. But that you could fight your way all the way into the target and then find you couldn't bomb. Have to bring the bombs back and drop them in the channel and know you had to go back the next day and do it again. There were two routes across. One was a northern route where you would leave Newfoundland and fly to Greenland and then Iceland and then across and refuel or in shorter hops. Whereas we went direct from Gander Lake directly to Scotland. In order to navigate that course, we had picket ships stationed along the route, sending out homing signals that we would home on. The German U-boats, would mimic those signals and try to lead us astray. And so we had to discern whether we were getting the correct signal or not. And that was very, very iffy. But they were doing everything they could to have us, giving us false signals and go out to sea and never be heard from again. He had to do astro navigation, where they navigate by the stars and take fixes. And I'm not sure of the technology that they employed, but that's how ships navigate. And we had to resort to the same type of navigation until we eventually got some electronic means of navigating, and that helped us immeasurably. Flying in combat, though, flying the B-17 was very challenging because most of it was in formation, and you were having to maintain a set position and relationship to other aircraft. When you're at a high altitude and you're contending with this extreme cold, all of a sudden, when you're over the target and in the heat of battle, you can suddenly realize that in spite of the cold atmosphere, you're perspiring in buckets. And that perspiration freezes instantly. And the worst part of that was that it would block our flow of oxygen, which we had to have or we couldn't subsist. So you had to break up the ice crystals with one hand in your mask and fly with the other. It isn't something that I love that I like to recall. The memories of it and the consequences of those memories are bittersweet. We hesitated to make friendships, form very close friendships because of the losses.